Welcome to another video of GeoSpinach. Today with me I have Antonis Lukas, a student of economics, and he also studied mathematics, and brilliant mind when it comes to discussing economics and geopolitics, and even in subjects to war. And he's especially good when it comes to asking the right questions. So today I want to talk about China and Taiwan, and I want someone to keep me on the ground. So for the general audience to understand specifically what I mean. So look up, please take it from here.
Hello. Yeah. With the recent events of Taiwan, China heating up, many questions came up to my mind, and I want to discuss about them because Taiwan is basically the largest semiconductor producer in the world. It's 80% of the market. China is the biggest factor in the world, but it also has a huge debt problem, and both countries are embedded in the USA debt system. So how possible is how likely is the chance of China attacking Taiwan, and how actually did it all start? When did it all start?
So let's start with a very brief history of the China-Taiwanese conflict, or for the Chinese viewers, there is only one China. So once the communists took over of China in 1949, so this is China, the borders of China. Once they took it over, their biggest issue was the fact they didn't have a navy. The Republic of China retreated to the small island of Taiwan, which since then, both of them declare that they are the main Chinese government. Now, China, since the times of Mao, declared that they want vengeance and they want to take Taiwan back, and that Taiwan is rightfully theirs. Now, those threats weren't any meaningful threats because China was a really poor economy. And even if it did had a large army, it didn't actually had any navy. So the actual threat to Taiwan was non-existent. The moment the United States started, and while still recognizing China in 1979, placed its sixth fleet or seventh fleet to the Bay of Taiwan, practically saying to China that Taiwan will remain a free democracy under our influence, which in today's term, the influence of the United States in the East Asia region looks something like this, let's say. Okay, so this blue area over here, this is the region, and Taiwan is the centerpiece of that region. The reason this topic is very important to be discussed is because if China were to attack Taiwan, okay, and let's say the US doesn't protect Taiwan and it abandons it, then immediately all the countries surrounding the Middle Asian countries, so the countries, for example, from Myanmar to Laos, Vietnam, the Indonesia, and so forth, the countries that are not immediately part of the zones of influence of the US, but they have been allowed, let's say, to remain neutral, will immediately have to choose the Chinese side. Because if China can invade and take Taiwan, then they don't stand a chance. And here is the biggest issue that arises. It's a game theory example. Now, up to this point, it was a zero-sum game. The Chinese economy was gradually rising up. It was becoming richer, more capitalistic, and it was embedding in the world economic system. All the world started loving China and producing factories in China. As a result, China became much, much richer. But the root of the evil lies in the details, in the fact that China is still a dictatorship, a totalitarian regime under a communist government that is willing to kill millions, and I'm putting a big emphasis on this, and they have a massive debt issue. And anyone thinking that the US has a debt issue, it doesn't even compare to the Chinese debt issue. We're talking about the private individual debt of China. We're talking about 30 to 40 trillion dollars. The actual worth of the Chinese economy, while proclaiming to be around 11 trillion dollars, the possible numbers are probably 7, because they're a dictatorial regime and they're playing with numbers. And what I am concluding to is that the current state of China is a very fragile state, a very, very, very fragile state. And whenever China becomes very fragile, it tends to act very aggressively against its neighbors. So in the 1980s, when the whole collapse of the Soviet Union happened by the end of the 1980s and 1990s, they staged protests against Japan, for example, that went out of control. The same with South Korea. The influence with Myanmar, border conflicts with India. The Chinese CCP, the Communist Party of China, always tries to move the blame somewhere else as to divert the opinion of the people to the failures of the system. They even actually fought a war with Vietnam, and actually, well, they argue that they won that war, but in all practicality, the fact that they didn't manage to capture Vietnam is the indication that they lost the war with Vietnam. So the argument is that China, the more unstable it becomes, and inevitably it will become more unstable, it will lash out. Now, if the debt crisis of China now goes and collapses, then the CCP, the Communist Party of China, has a real chance of collapse. And now the circumstances are much different than in 1949. The Chinese economy is much more developed. They have managed to build more than 270 military bases over here where I'm pointing at. Now, the South China Sea, it's a lake of the regime, let's say. And the reason this note is very important is the fact that China now doesn't care about protecting its southern flank because of all of those islands. At the same time, China has developed a navy out of nowhere. And while that navy in numbers does not compare to the US Navy, in the South China Sea, and specifically if we were to zoom in to the Taiwanese Strait, then the Chinese could, in theory, concentrate a massive navy here that will be much, much larger than the American Sixth Fleet. And they also trained 12 new marine divisions, which is the first time that China has ever done so. And the biggest argument that China is going to war with Taiwan is the proclamation of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping publicly stated that China is going to retake Taiwan and that Taiwan is part of China. And they're actively doing so. Now, we can go much deeper into Chinese politics, and eventually we'll make probably a video talking about the intrigues of the politics of China. But the main issue is that Xi Jinping now is the first leader after Mao Zedong that has true absolute authority within China. And as a result, the possibility and the threat of attacking Taiwan is a real threat. And it's a threat that the West kind of ignores at the moment, and they're focusing on Ukraine, which is the easy target. And the big question is, will the West respond? Will the West respond in attacking if an attack were to come? What China has to lose. So if their economy is going to collapse anyways, and if the economy collapses, the 9% economic growth also collapses, then the Communist Party will most probably also collapse. What stops the communist regime from launching a direct assault to Taiwan?
Um, something I want to ask here. Because of Taiwan's importance in the technological market, how can the West ignore these threats in Taiwan? How and can the West handle a war with China in Taiwan?
So the question, ask the question again a bit more precisely.
Okay. The question here is, how can the West ignore Xi Jinping's threats for taking Taiwan? And can even the West handle a war in Taiwan?
My argument is that the West, if it wants to, it can easily stop any attack on Taiwan by, for example, Taiwan joining NATO makes 10 times more sense than Ukraine joining NATO, because Taiwan is a functioning democracy, and it has been a functioning democracy for the past at least 50 years. Taiwan is a major economic player in the world. And Taiwan, as we said, is the pinhole of the defense of the East Asia in general, and is a country indirectly threatened by the second biggest world power in the world. Russia is not a true competitor to the US. China is. So the NATO alliance, when it was created to deflect the expansion of the Soviet Union. Now that the Soviet Union is gone, the biggest threat to the West in general is China. Up to this point, China has been silent, but the past 10 years under Xi Jinping, we've seen China's policy start using soft power, building military bases all around the world, provoking its neighbors, and the biggest topic here, provoking a possible war with Taiwan. China is relying on the fact that the US is too weak culturally, militaristically, to actually respond. So China is willing to take 1 million casualties. Is the West even willing to take 1,000 casualties for Taiwan? And my biggest issue here is that the West and the majority of Western nations don't understand the failures if they choose not to intervene. So if they allow China to intervene in Taiwan and attack Taiwan and capture Taiwan, then I think you have a game theory case where the US does absolutely nothing, continually trades with China and accepts the loss. The US goes to a trade war against China, but loses Taiwan anyway, and at the same time loses all of the allies it has in the Pacific. Or the other choice, which is the only, in my opinion, the only practicable case for the United States, actually embed Taiwan into NATO or send more fleets into the Taiwanese Straits, even send troops to Taiwan, make a statement to China. Because the Western world is not only the United States, also includes Europe. Europe and the United States are much stronger compared to China. And China is not going to find any allies in India, which is the other possible and forthcoming power in the world. The only friend it can find is some African countries and Russia. So the West, at the moment right now, it has the economic as well as the military authority to stop any expansion. My worry is whether they have the will to do it. And I think that's the biggest issue we are facing right now. So, for example, you and Donny, if, for example, Cyprus was part of NATO, how would you think that sending troops to Taiwan will feel for you?
Wouldn't feel great. Let's be honest here. But I think it's kind of a bad example because Cyprus already faces another problem. Yeah. I don't think the Western countries want to send troops to Taiwan to defend Taiwan.
And I think that is the game that China is currently playing. China perfectly understands this. The US of the 1980s and the 1990s, especially under Reagan, was a US that was willing to fight any possible threat with any possible means. As George Washington said, you don't have a strong army to do war. You have a strong army to prevent a war. The threat, just the mere threat that the two strongest economic powers in the world, Europe and the United States, which with their influence in the rest of the world will inevitably devastate you. So yes, the West and the US will take a massive economic downfall from a Chinese collapse, but they will recover actually quite fast. I'm not a doomsday. The way they embedded into the Chinese economy was super fast in less than 10 years. So the West actually adapting to other countries, which it does right now. So it's building factories in Bangladesh, in India, in Nigeria, and so forth. The fact that it's adapting, the capitalistic system is inherently built in a way that's really adaptable. The hit that the West will take will not be comparable to the hit that China will take, assuming that China will act to its promise if its economy is bound to fail anyways. The game is played on the assumption that if China's economy fails, which it is the most likely scenario, and an attempted attack on Taiwan also fails, then the Communist Party of China will fall, which will be the biggest success for the West. And I'm not talking about success in regards to the West pushing their own ideas into China, as they did in the Middle East and so forth, but not having a totalitarian regime controlling the second biggest economy in the world, which is the current issue. Maybe having a country like India. India probably is one of the best examples you can have of a neutral nation. A massive economy that's very wealthy in resources. It's very poor currently, but has a massive potential. And its principles are very democratic, but they are not Western. That's not a problem for the West. This is the best possible thing we can have. Open trade with countries such as India. And this is the China we want, right?
Yeah, this is the China that we want. But the issue is USA has a lot of debt in China as well. Can USA economically come face to face with China?
What you are arguing here is the problem. The biggest problem is that the Chinese debt, ironically enough, was actually funded by US companies, and not the US government specifically, but by US companies. And those US companies have quite a lobbying power. Now, for the majority of this lobbying group, they will side with China and guarantee. They have all their factories in China. Yes, Taiwan produces semiconductors, but if China takes Taiwan, then they can still get their semiconductors from Taiwan. So what you're arguing is actually a very important topic, the fact that the same capitalistic system that we strive for is the same system that uh, pushes the West to allowing a totalitarian regime to be way more aggressive, which is the definition of an irony. But yes, you're absolutely right on this.
I can see a world where USA gets involved in this war, actually, if it happens. So I
Yes, it's quite a tricky question, And up to this point, we have been to more rhetoric. So China is proclaiming an attack. Xi Jinping has gained massive power, but the extent that he truly possesses that power that he proclaims to possess, it's still unknown. So this is the big question mark. This is the big if. My argument, this whole discussion was made that assuming that the Chinese economy is going to fail, which is a safe assumption to make, assuming that the Communist Party of China is unified in their response, which is this is not a guaranteed assumption, then yes, China is most likely going to invade Taiwan, and inevitably the West and the United States, but the West in general, is bound to respond. And failing to respond will guarantee lead us immediately to a very cold second Cold War. Any closing remarks, Antonis? Yay, another war.
Yeah, another one.
Thank you guys for watching GeoSpinach. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you have more questions specifically on the topic of China or other geopolitical issues that you are interested and you want, for example, my opinion on it, I'm gladly to give it. Thank you for watching and good night.